That with you guys. So again, thank you for being with us for our UDO session today, our UDO University session. This is our third installment of UDO University. And today we're going to be covering the UDO tree preservation requirements. Next slide. Quickly go over a couple of meeting protocols. Today's session has been pulled together and orchestrated by our CLT development staff. I am helping to narrate today. Today's presenter is Tim Porter, our Chief Urban Forester, which is he's also the division manager of our newest division within Planning, Design, and Development, our Community Tree Canopy Preservation Division. We are asking that you use the chat function to type any questions that you have. Our goal is to answer those questions in the chat throughout the session. If time allows, we will answer any questions that have not been answered in the chat at the end of the session. If your question cannot be answered for whatever reason, we need to do more research and come back to you. We will so note those and follow up with a response posted on the website, and we will possibly review it the next session. The mission statement for UDO University. The purpose of UDO University is to acquaint attendees with the City of Charlotte's requirements and processes affiliated with the currently adopted Unified Development Ordinance. Comments made at UDO University sessions are intended to provide guidance and are non-binding on the formal review of the development plans. Very quickly, you guys have seen this before because you are in the session with us. We are hosting 10 sessions initially. There's some speak around possibly an additional session, but currently we have 10 sessions scheduled. We are on the third instance of those sessions. Registration is required for each. Exactly how you got to us today, you registered at charlotteudo.org under the UDO University tab. Sessions are each Friday from 1 to 2:30. All sessions are recorded and they are hosted via Zoom. Then they are posted back on the website. Not only the recording for the session, but also the PowerPoint presentation will be recorded. Our goal is to have those up within 48 business hours after the session has ended. These sessions are facilitated by various agencies within the CLT Development Center, and each session will be built upon information provided in a previous session. And please just be reminded that you can watch the recordings and access the PowerPoint presentations about 48 business hours after the presentation ends. And as you can see on the screen very quickly, there are a list of the current sessions. You can see those at the website as well. This next slide does kind of give you a list of those as well, and you can see those on the website. So now I am going to kick it over to Tim Porter to do the presentation today.
Thank you, Yolanda, and good afternoon, everyone. There's a lot of detail in this presentation. Going to cover parts of every section of the UDO tree regulations. So I'm going to blitz through some slides and spend more time on other slides. This first slide is an image that you've likely seen. It's been used many times in presentations, kind of connecting the dots on the vision and implementation regarding policy and ordinance concepts directly related to the UDO. I slapped this City of Trees Tree Canopy Action Plan image on there just to provide some quick context to better explain how tree canopy policy was completely overhauled, reviewed, and changed over the last couple of years through the comprehensive plan. And the biggest tool we have to implement that policy is the Unified Development Ordinance. So the Tree Canopy Action Plan provided policy recommendations up to the comprehensive plan that was adopted by council, and also ordinance concepts to council that were included in the UDO. So here are the meeting purposes for today, really covering the tree preservation requirements in Article 20, and the term tree protection article has also been used, and I wanted to make a quick clarifying statement that was terminology used in the first draft of the UDO. The regulations have been moved from a separate article into Article 20, landscape screening and tree preservation. So a little bit more detail about that kind of orientation of where these regulations are located. Sections 20.13 through 20.18 of Article 20 will be administered by Urban Forestry. Henry Kunzig's the Urban Forestry Supervisor. So that team will be reviewing and inspecting plans and sites related to that. The first half of that article is administered by zoning. I also want to mention the tree ordinance, which currently houses all tree-related development requirements, does still exist. All regulations are now in the UDO that are development related. There is a heritage tree regulation that's non-development related is in the tree ordinance, and we'll talk briefly about that during this presentation today. So historically, there's been three main focus areas for tree regulation: street trees, internal trees, and tree save. In the UDO, those focus areas have been expanded to include another major focus, heritage trees. We'll talk extensively about what that means and how that's regulated. And again, there are heritage tree components that are non-development in nature in the Charlotte Tree Ordinance. Major changes include heritage trees, a new focus, a new step into residential infill development, single lot development that currently isn't regulated but will be in the UDO, pertaining to tree canopy requirements. The Charlotte Tree Manual is going to be a new, robust supplemental document that will provide guidelines and standards that better explain development requirements, but also non-development related things too that'll be used by the community. But that's going to be a very important component of the development process. There's supplemental information in that manual that'll be used every day by customers and city staff. Tree save has been redefined and rebranded as green area, and the applicability has changed significantly. Tables 20-4 and 20-5 are going to be really important for how each of the main focus areas are applied or not. And wanted to mention that certain exemptions have been removed that are in the current ordinance for commercial type development. So getting right into the applicability, the triggers of just the broad new development trigger, facade changes, and minimum parking spaces are gone. They're removed. The new triggers are what you see there in 20.15, construction of a principal structure, cumulative increase of BUA or building coverage, or approval as a subdivision development. Each main focus area has an applicability statement, and for many of those focus areas, perimeter trees, internal trees, green area, heritage trees, the applicability is the same, but it does vary a little bit. So it's important to note that pay attention to the focus areas in this article to make sure that it applies to a development or not. Heritage trees, we're going to talk a lot about this. This is a big new step. It's a requirement that protects all native trees to North Carolina that are 30 inches or greater at DBH level. And that can only be applied to trees on property, private property, or publicly owned parcels. Heritage trees can occur in public street right-of-way, alleyways. City trees are not going to be classified as heritage trees if they're large and native. It's regulated in both development scenarios and in a new permitting process for non-development scenarios. This is something I talk extensively about with City Council during the adoption process. Heritage trees are protected even if there's no development occurring. That's a new thing for the city of Charlotte as far as tree canopy regulations on private property. So it's a big step, and we won't talk extensively about that non-development scenario today, but there will be a separate, more basic permitting process for non-development scenarios where property owners want to remove a heritage tree. Also wanted to add that the actual trunk and above ground part of the tree and the critical root zone, or CRZ, is protected. A little bit more detail about the preservation, applicability, and intent. Within the city limits, heritage trees are protected at all times. If it qualifies as a heritage tree per the native and size criteria in the city limits, then it is protected at all times, regardless of development status. In the ETJ, heritage trees are protected only by regulated development. It has to be triggered, that protection status. And the intent overall with heritage trees has three main areas. There's a preservation intent, a mitigation intent and purpose, and a monitoring and tracking intent. And in general, the preservation intent is a relaxed approach. It is not as strong. It doesn't have the teeth that city trees are protected. The mitigation, however, is strong, and we'll be tracking how many trees are removed each year through multiple permitting process. Removal generally is allowed for non-development scenarios. In development scenarios, removal is also allowed, but there has to be a demonstrated conflict. We'll talk more about that moving forward, but here's an example of some types of conflicts that would support and justify the removal of a heritage tree during development permitting. It has to be demonstrated on a submitted plan. More examples. I'll go down this table row by row. The first example, is there an existing heritage tree or trees within the proposed structure, building footprint, or other type of improvement, which could be parking lot, sidewalk, amenity features? Doesn't have to be required. It could be proposed, and there's no reasonable way to relocate that improvement, then again, the removal would be justified and the permit would be granted. Land development permitting, an approved plan by the city would suffice to meet a permit. Outside of land development permitting, there'd be an actual tree work permit for heritage trees. Second row, specific conflicts could include a required driveway, possibly a proposed driveway, site distance issues, utilities, stormwater infrastructure, etc. Yes, heritage trees can be removed if that's demonstrated on the plan, and you can't reasonably move that. Also, if access to a property is unreasonably restricted by preservation of a heritage tree, if a heritage tree would negatively impact the utility service to the site, or restricts the ability for property owners and managers to provide basic needed maintenance and corrections to the site and improvements on the site, then that would justify removal of a heritage tree. And of course, if a tree is hazardous or dying, that can be removed. That has to be documented by certified professionals. In cases of hazardous situations where immediate action is needed, trees can be removed, but there will be some base level of retro documentation needed by property owners. It could be as simple as photographs from residents, or basic witness statements, like the neighbor said, yeah, that tree had a crack in it from lightning, and it should have been removed. That type of thing would likely support removal for hazardous reasons. Mitigation. Mitigation is a strong intent here, and the requirements are significant. So for development scenarios, it's $1,500 per tree removed, heritage tree removed. For non-development, it's $500. That's typically considered property owners that are not going through permitting for land development. Minimum mitigation requirements are one tree has to be planted back on the site where a heritage tree is removed. Mitigation tree becomes a code required tree, and it cannot be used to meet other requirements in the tree protection, those main focus areas of the perimeter, internal, and green area. There's also a fee attached, $250. Fee reduction can take place at $250 per tree, additional mitigation tree planted. And if you plant enough, you can completely zero out your mitigation fee. And again, mitigation is waived if there's supporting documentation for health or hazardous reasons. No mitigation required in those situations. I'll leave this table up for a minute because I wanted to draw a distinction between development and non-development here. Mitigation is a strong component of this new focus area and this new requirement. So let me go back one second and just talk a little bit about what the fees will go to. Collected fees from heritage tree permitting, mitigation fees, will support a new program called the Canopy Care Program. That program will provide assistance to property owners to help maintain large trees on private property throughout the city, including helping property owners maintaining hazardous or declining trees on their property. It also will support replanting to offset the canopy loss by heritage tree removal. So customers who are required to replant for mitigation requirements, we're talking with Tree Charlotte, trying to develop some type of partner program that would provide a very easily accessible program where customers can get high quality trees to meet the mitigation planting requirement and assistance to know what trees to plant and how to plant them. And that's something we want to have in place as soon as possible to support this new regulation. Green area, was another major change. This is the evolution of Tree Save. Tree Save is still there. It's expanded and be redefined or rebranded as something called Green Area. And there's increased requirements and flexibility within this focus area. Again, the current commercial exemptions, which are, for example, a handful of those are, if there's an existing building on a site that's retained, that would allow a developing site to be exempt from Tree Save. Sites that are zoned TOD or a handful of other type of zoning designations within transit station area plans, they're exempt. In the future in the UDO, there are no exemptions of that type that are continuing forward. So that's an important designation. However, the new area that we're regulating, which is, residential infill development, single lot, single building development, where single family detached homes, duplexes, triplexes, or quads, those will not have to meet the green area requirement. They will be exempt. However, there's a situation where existing sites may have Tree Save on the property that's attached to an older subdivision project or some other project that would have to be maintained. If it's related to another project that still has to meet that compliance, existing Tree Save on one of these lots may have to be maintained. It's really important to note there's been a pivot and a change to the new place type designation as the driver that assigns green area options and requirements. Right now, those are familiar with the centered corridor and wedge growth framework that really drives how Tree Save requirements and options are applied and available. That's gone. Place types now takes over as the main driver. Another big important general change is that universally green area is now across the board. When it applies, it's 15% of a site. Previously, single family subdivision only had to provide 10%. Now it's 15% for all development types, except for those single lot residential infill types. It's 15% for every site. So again, green area, place types. This is a table for designers, developers. That's going to be very, very quickly, familiar. It's going to be used all the time by staff and customers on a daily basis. Tiers is the main dividing approach now. Requirements and options are divided up by tiers based on place type designation. There are a few examples of place type plus a zoning designation, but by and large, it's mostly simplified to place types. This table will be very important. And it also applies to other focus areas, not just green area. It applies to perimeter tree planting and internal tree planting as well. This is another table, and it's going to be a little bit confusing at first, but table 20.5 is going to be the big kind of clarifying table that provides guidance on green area credits. That includes requirements, options, and incentives. And there's clear guidance in the UDO of how to use these multipliers. We are also developing many Charlotte Tree Manual guidelines, and one of those is going to be a worksheet for customers, designers, developers to much more easily have a framework to calculate what green area and other requirements are applicable. And then if you have the ability to use one of these many options here under the green area credits table list, you can kind of plug and play and calculate how to do that. Please leave this on the screen for a minute. Table 20-4 and 20-5 are going to be very important tables. And I think, with designers and developers, we'll be talking a lot about how green area applies. As you can see, going down this list, tree save is still, a primary focus of what that green area, bucket of requirements is. But there's also new options to donate land to the city's programs or the county's programs for conservation or park and recreation. The green roof component that we currently have has been relaxed and improved, hopefully, as something that's actually viable for customers. You can see that here. There's 3 options there. Green walls is an option now with reduced credit. For example, a green roof is the intent purpose there says green roof and terrace treatments are important. They don't provide as many environmental benefits as standard tree canopy on surface grade. So there's a reduced ratio there. But there's more options in how you provide that as long as you qualify. The availability of all the options has been expanded. We've revamped the offsite mitigation option to hopefully be more applicable and usable and viable. And last, but certainly not least, I've underlined contiguous here because that is a very important change. Contiguous is something that tree save that's a main intent and purpose now. The tree save is provided in a contiguous way. There are some exceptions to that, but what came out of the comprehensive plan, the tree canopy action plan, was a higher level preference and emphasis on contiguous preserved tree canopy. So that's going to be certainly a new challenge to face in design, in property development, and due diligence. Apologies, this slide kind of hits the eyeball a little weird, but there are some footnotes to that table. So let me go back to the previous. You can see there's some footnotes. See footnote 1 here. Hopefully you can see my cursor. There's another footnote here and here, and there's 2, and there's more. This table provides some additional guidance at the bottom in the footnotes. I'm not going to go through all of these right now, but this presentation will be available for folks to review and get a better understanding, but also based other questions on that we can answer later on this presentation or at another time through the website and subsequent future meetings. For example, let me look at this middle one here. Oops, sorry. Land dedication to Mecklenburg County Park and Recreation, footnote 2. This is only allowed for residential development in these place types and zoning designations. And that's really for tree save that are part of larger single family subdivision development. The bottom footnote here, item 3 for payment in lieu, we're carrying forward the requirement that payment in lieu may not be used in combination with offsite mitigation. So those footnotes are important to note as well as just additional guidance and clarifying statements as to how the options here in table 20-5 apply. The same thing goes for these new incentives. This is something I wanted to note. These are not really options. They're more of an incentives that can be used in combination. You can't compound and stack these on top of each other, but if a site you're developing has any of these and you want to use them, you can use them and get the extra credit, so to speak. Preservation of specimen trees or heritage trees, you get double credit. That's an improvement, or that's an increase in the amount of credit that a development site would obtain. If you preserve canopy adjacent to other sites, tree save, that's extra credit. If you preserve tree canopy contiguous with streams and on steep slopes, and there's the footnote pertaining to it that says it has to be a delineated, stream, and you have to, depict that in your plan submittal. So more green area. Heritage trees and green area are the real meaty sections, and the two of the really big new changes to the tree preservation requirements. Right now, only certain items can be subtracted when you calculate your green area for single-family subdivision development. In the future, that's been consolidated to apply across the board. If you're required to meet green area requirements, you have the ability to subtract out these items when you're calculating your green area requirements. There's been an increased emphasis on invasive species management, so there's some additional steps that developers, property owners, property managers will have to take on for tree save if there's invasive species within those areas. As a standard going forward, amenity elements, gazebos, other types of trails, benches, there's more examples in the actual UDO in that section 20.15E. They are allowable per standard. They'll have to be reviewed during plan review or after the fact to make sure the disturbance and impact on trees and tree save is limited. But by standard, they're allowed and they can be part of initial submittals. Tree save areas may be dedicated to Mecklenburg County Park and Rec, also to the city's tree canopy preservation program, and there'll be criteria developed and shared prior to the implementation of the UDO. As I said earlier, the Charlotte Tree Manual is something that we're working on now, which has additional guidelines and tree standards that will be reviewed by the city's tree commission, by the city's, the DSTAT committee, which is a joint committee. We'll obtain feedback and thoughts and guidance from those two groups and bring it into our work on the Charlotte Tree Manual and adjust and revise those guidelines as it makes sense as needed. At the bottom of this slide, something that's not technically a ordinance change, the formula for payment in lieu as a tree or green area option is not changing. It's the same exact formula. The cap value pertaining to that option for tree save is changing. Part of that's based on Mecklenburg County appraised tax values for land, not improvements, for land, for parcels. Currently, that's based on county reval values from pre-2010. So we have changed the cap value from 80,100. We've just updated per the formula to, as you can see there, 192,626 per acre. That's a big change. Again, not an ordinance change, but it's a very commonly used option. So that's going to have an impact on development. Want to make sure that was understood. We've talked about that a lot during the UDO adoption process. So another key change, and this is a big step for the city, we're stepping into a new regulatory world for private property tree canopy regulations. Heritage trees is one of the big steps, but also regulating residential infill development for single lots type infill development. We're not doing that now. We will be in the future. We expect the occurrences for that to be in the thousands. That's a really big step, and it's a high volume area. The applicability for that type of development does change, or it does vary from the other focus areas. And here it is here in this snip from the UDO. This section is called the frontage tree planting requirement. So construction of a new single-family duplex, triplex, or quadruplex structure within those designated areas requires street tree planting, or perimeter tree planting, as it's commonly known. That's a new step. Street trees can be planted in the right-of-way or in the front yards of sites, and existing trees can be preserved to meet that requirement. But that's a new regulated thing that's going to impact a new customer base, and it's going to impact property owners in a different way than it does now. There's no green area component for this type of development. There's no internal tree component here. But if there's existing heritage trees or tree safe on a site that triggers this type of applicability, those would have to be preserved or mitigated for, depending on what flexibility exists. So if there's a heritage tree on private property on one of these development sites that triggers the frontage tree requirement, then that's something that would have to be addressed through permitting, preserved or removed and mitigated. That's a big step. Of course, city trees would have to be protected and preserved, like currently on other development sites we regulate. But for frontage tree scenarios, city trees would also have to be protected, tree protection fencing, and all that would have to be included on a plan submittal. General tree planting requirements for most of the focus areas, not frontage, but for most of the other focus areas, particularly perimeter trees and internal trees, but also green area and heritage trees, have been consolidated into this section, and centralized. There's a new emphasis on native species. Native species are going to have to be a large component of most of the regulated sites the city sees for tree canopy, 75%. You can check out that section in the UDO for a little bit more guidance. There's a new proximity requirement that is going to be very impactful. Required trees, whether it's internal or perimeter, replanted trees for green area or heritage tree compliance, have to be located at least 10 feet from buildings when feasible. So that last part of the requirement, and that's actually in the UDO, when feasible, indicates that we're very focused on providing the best growing medium for trees as possible, but we understand that it's very difficult in many situations to get 10 feet from everything. When there's so many things competing for space, there's going to be a reasonable approach. It'll be clearly stated in the Charlotte Tree Manual that 10 feet is where we're starting, and we're going to really try to hold customers to that as reasonably as possible, but you're not going to need a variance from the UDO board to adjust your tree from off an underground, fiber optic line to 8 feet. There is a little bit of a relaxed approach to that, but we are definitely shooting for 10 feet. There's a little bit of a change to site lighting. We provided some guidance in the table. 20.6 will be commonly used. Again, on the left column here, those tiers, they don't just apply to green area, they apply to tree planting requirements as well. So 20-4, as you can see here, is going to be a very important table to provide guidance on green area and tree planting requirements. And there it is again, 20-4. I should save that statement for my next slide. At the bottom of the slide, I'm not trying to hide this, but this is very important. It's happening now in many cases, but this is required per the tree regulations going forward, is that perimeter tree planting on network private streets is now required. So that's something that'll get greater attention now from the urban forestry team. Continuing on with perimeter tree planting requirements, there's spacing provisions that provide flexibility It's based on tiers, but there is the ability to, again, we're starting with a 40-foot spacing for large mature and 30-foot spacing for small mature trees. Really would like to see that, but there is provisions. I'm not showing every single provision and option that's in this section of the UDO, but there is language that says that can be adjusted from 40 feet to 30 feet, depending on certain scenarios. So there's flexibility there. We're trying to be clearer and more precise about when that flexibility is there and when it's not. Alternate locations, that's something that'll be very clearly provided in the Charlotte Tree Manual. Is if the planting in the amenity zone or planting strip is infeasible, alternate locations may be considered. In most cases on the site that's developing. In this provision, it could be 20 feet back of curb. In other scenarios, and maybe elsewhere on the site. NCDOT right-of-way. That's been very challenging over the last few years. This provision here just clearly states what we're doing already now, really seeking to avoid planting trees at NCDOT right-of-way as much as possible. But there is some guidance there on how that will be applied going forward. Continued NCDOT. So moving on to internal, which is mostly thought of as parking lots, but there's a key component to the impervious requirement. Traditionally, like right now, internal trees is a twofold approach. It's have parking coverage, but also have a minimum quantity for the amount of impervious cover on a total site. And so that focus area is continuing forward. The applicability trigger of 9 parking spaces or greater is gone, but the coverage requirement is still there. No changes to the 40-foot spacing rule for parking spaces. Again, this slide just emphasizes that table 20-4 is really important. There is some more flexibility on where these trees can be planted. Again, parking coverage still has to be met, but there is some flexibility on where those trees can be to a point. And that really speaks to an understanding that sites are very difficult to find space for trees at times, and we want to value coverage for impervious, but also providing appropriate growing space for trees. So you have high quality trees that says that they can grow to their full potential. There are some special conditions and flexibility for townhome and multifamily for internal trees. Section 20.17D addresses that. (20.18) administration and process. This covers things that are already happening now. It clarifies it, changes some terminology, really touches on what are required for plan submittal, tree survey, a tree compliance plan, a tree and critical root zone protection plan, tree planting plan, and green area plan. Those are all things, those first 4 bullets, that are already required now. There are a few additional elements that will be required, but that's essentially a landscape sheet. And there's some other sheets that are included in plan submittal that can provide those 4 things, but those are not new. There may be a little bit of change for each one. One of the changes and new items in the 5th bullet is the spatial tree data plan. We are working to develop GIS layers where we can easily provide information to customers on where their protected trees are. So we're looking to develop maps that provide layers of perimeter trees, internal trees, tree save, heritage trees. We'll put that in GIS and make it available. So there's a requirement now that CAD data is provided at the time of permitting. And we'll provide guidance in the Charlotte Tree Manual as to how that will work. Listen to DSTAC, listen to the Tree Commission to get feedback on what makes the most sense for that. And then platting and recording. That ordinance concept is not new. There are additional items required as part of that, but it's not a new thing that development customers will have to do. There are some changes to that. And again, the Charlotte Tree Manual and UDO will provide clearer guidance. I didn't include every section in this presentation. It's already a very long presentation, so I wanted to make sure we had time for questions. A little bit more detail from the actual UDO on what tree survey requirements will look like. I think it's a little bit more clear now, and the existing requirement in the tree ordinance is a little bit confusing. One thing I wanted to note here at the bottom for A6 is any area of the site, including green roof or green wall that will be provided to meet green area requirements, needs to be delineated and provided on the survey, in the plan submittal. The tree and the CRZ protection plan, that's already required and provided now. The CRZ component is new. I don't envision having a critical root zone requirement for every single protected or required tree, but particularly related to heritage trees, there will be a focus on that. Any tree, again, at the bottom here, any existing specimen tree that will be utilized for extra credit or for heritage tree mitigation needs to be identified on the plan. I didn't touch on that earlier, kind of glanced over it, but sites that are removing heritage trees, if there is an opportunity and if selected by customers to preserve existing specimen trees, which are simply put high value, large mature trees, slightly smaller than heritage trees, and larger small mature trees. If those are preserved, those can account for the mitigation requirements of a removed heritage tree. So I think that's a great option for customers to look at. If you can identify those, it's certainly going to increase survey requirements and costs, but that's another way to kind of balance out the mitigation requirement. At the end of this article is an administrative adjustments table that states what sections have flexibility and administrative, I guess, qualification to vary from quantitative standards, which could be spacing requirements, something with numbers. That is something where there's going to be built-in flexibility. Again, the Charlotte Tree Manual will build upon this table to clearly explain for each of those sections, 14 through 17, for each of those standards, what that built-in flexibility is. It's not intended to be something to design to on day one, but when there is a reasonable supporting reason why to vary from certain quantitative standards, this table and its corresponding guideline, the Charlotte Tree Manual, will explain that in greater detail. At the end of the article is this description of the Chief Urban Forester position, duties. The Urban Forestry Supervisor is a designee, and that position and the team underneath the supervisor, Henry Kunzig, are the ones that are managing the UDO tree regulations and the non-development tree regulation for heritage trees in the updated tree ordinance. So the Charlotte Tree Ordinance still exists, was updated simultaneously with the UDO, and it was adopted by council. It is a much smaller version than it is today, as all the development requirements are no longer in there, but there is the non-development heritage tree component in there, and the land development group of urban forestry will be managing that. Additionally, within this section of the UDO, there's multiple statements that are similar to or exactly stated as unless otherwise approved by the chief urban forester. What that means is that, as I said many times today, the Charlotte Tree Manual will be a driving, guiding reference for customers, staff, and the public on how to comply with requirements, what flexibility and variations may be allowed, by right and by standard, the administrative adjustments, and the ultimate plan provisions process. All that's stated within the UDO in this article. Those are the things that are really connected to, unless otherwise approved by the chief urban forester. I'm not going to be out there, looking at things individually and making calls based on my opinion or how I'm feeling that day. There's going to be guiding documentation and reference material that displays the flexibility on administrative adjustments and otherwise approved by the urban forester. I did want to note that in summer of 2021, the General Assembly revised General Statute 160D. And that connected and covered a lot of things in the land development world, but something particular to the urban forestry group is that, well, I should say the entire tree canopy world for the city, is that it removed staff level administrative authority to grant variances or to make decisions that are significant deviations from stated requirements and stated standards. That ability no longer exists. Of course, there's an appeal and variance process, but the ability for myself or the urban forestry supervisor or the city arborist to grant official or unofficial variances just no longer exists. But we built in a lot of flexibility and administrative adjustment opportunities into the UDO. So there is flexibility there, but it's not unlimited as it was before. And again, I've mentioned it many times, but I wanted to say that the Charlotte Tree Manual, which is a set of guidelines and land development standards, are currently being reviewed and developed by staff. They'll be provided to the DSTAC group and the Charlotte Tree Advisory Commission for review and feedback and comment. And we're targeting a publishment of those standards and guidelines in April 2022. And so I'm going to stop. And I've been talking for a long time now. I appreciate your attention and your interest, and we can transition into questions.
Thank you, Tim. We do have a very lively chat. I want to say a special thank you to Henry Kunzig and Andrew also, who have been helping to kind of facilitate some answering within the chat. We do, however, have questions that may not have been answered in the chat, and I just want to read those out. Tim, maybe you can weigh in and give some help in answering those. The first comes from Diane Long, and she's asking if you could please define critical root zone or CRZ. And you're muted, Tim, I think you went back on mute.
Clicking all types of buttons now. Thank you. So critical root zone or CRZ is a very important component of tree regulations, and we're developing a guideline that will really clearly explain what that is dimension wise and what type of tree disturbing activity can be allowed within that. Simply put, it's the important critical root component of a tree. Right now, our current development standards say trees must be protected root zones 1 foot for every inch of diameter. The CRZ requirement is going to follow that approach. There'll be different zones within that greater CRZ area that will have varying levels of flexibility for how they can be disturbed. So that's what I can't provide specific dimensions right now, but that's something that'll be part of the draft Charlotte Tree Manual. They'll be coming out soon for review and comment by DSTAC and the Tree Commission.
Thank you, Tim. The next question comes from Liz Lewis, and she asks, with the heritage tree mitigation and replanting trees, is there a requirement to plant larger maturing trees, or do smaller ornamental trees meet the rules?
So the intent, purpose, and I think the actual requirement is to plant large mature trees back. Heritage trees are defined as large native trees and shade trees, and we want to replenish canopy to offset what was lost. So the objective is to have large mature mitigation trees planted back.
Okay. Matt Langston asks, single family duplex quad exemption, is that defined as existing lots of record?
That's a great question. I think that's something I'd have to research and talk to the subdivision folks to make sure I have a great, clear answer for that. Let's take that one down and follow up with Matt. Make sure I don't misspeak right now.
And we do have all of your info. Oh, looks like maybe that was answered a little bit later on. So maybe the team did some research. I'm sorry. It looks like I might have missed that one. So the next question. Sorry, guys, there's a lot of questions in the chat. I've been trying to keep up on the background. All right. Thomas asks, since the place type maps are going to take a while to be generated as we rezone sites, that doesn't necessarily overlay with the comprehensive land use plan. Will we need to request modifications of the base place types as part of the rezoning so that the tree ordinance guidelines overlay with our proposed zoning type? Is there a process to request place type adjustments? I don't know if you want to.
Don't know if I can adequately answer that one right
Okay.
now. Definitely.
And we can reach out to that team, our team, to get an answer for you. Okay.
Great question, though.
Next comes from
Thomas. Give me an easier one next time.
And I have to chuckle because Mr. Fields does right. Why does this have to be so complicated? Quite honestly, it's a lot. I totally get it. It is a lot of information. So Laura Handleton asks, are there any exceptions to needing contiguous tree slave? For example, on a large site, could there be two separate areas that are certain acreage?
Yes, there can be exceptions, and that'll be provided in the guideline we're developing. And I was just talking about that earlier today with Henry Kunzig. Let me scroll to my notes on that. So one example is if there is areas on a developing site that qualify for the incentives. And let me see if I can kind of scroll back here in the presentation. Sorry if I'm making people seasick here. These incentives as part of the green area table 20-5. If a site has areas that qualify for these, such as independent, standalone heritage trees or specimen trees, they can be used, excuse me, to meet green area requirements if they're not contiguous. You could have a patch of forest on a very steep slope that's on the other side of a site from your main contiguous tree save. That's an example of I would say exceptions or ways that there could be non-contiguous patches of tree save. Also, if there's a transmission or distribution power line right of way that separates two patches of forest, right? Of course, because under the power lines, there's not going to be any trees. If there's one of those rights of way that separate forested areas, that could be considered for tree safe compliance. They're not contiguous, but if there's a primary patch and a secondary patch, if there are specimen trees and heritage trees within those areas, that could be considered an exception where there's multiple patches that are not contiguous, but they could meet that requirement. And we're developing a guideline that better states that from what I just said. But yes, there are scenarios where there could be exceptions. Hopefully that answered the question.
Sharon Robinson asks, how can citizens actively preserve the tree canopy in our communities and neighborhoods? Land near my neighborhood was recently purchased by a developer. How can we preserve more trees since this will impact our community?
Well, by right development is a thing that property owners have, that they can develop sites as local and state and federal ordinances and regulations say they can. I would suggest if there's a way you can be involved in any conditional rezonings in your area, definitely take steps to be aware of anything that's changing like that. That's a way to be involved in potential development and impacts to trees. Trees Charlotte is a nonprofit group we work closely with. That's very focused on tree education and tree planting. That's a group that can provide many opportunities for your community. Within the development process, there's not very obvious community, driven ways to be involved. Again, it's a development permitting process, but Tree Charlotte, conditional rezonings, I think those are two opportunities. The heritage tree regulation, which is new, is intended to reduce the amount of canopy loss in neighborhoods. We learned in the most recent tree canopy analysis that took place during the Tree Canopy Action Plan 2 years ago that the greatest amount of tree canopy loss is being experienced in residential areas on individual lots in an incremental approach. So we've tried to combat that with this new heritage tree regulation and new frontage planting regulation for residential lots. I think the mitigation requirements will be incentive enough in some situations for customers to preserve trees. So, that's the best answer I can give right now.
Thank you for that. The next question comes from Beth Powell. If you are preserving a portion of tree saved but don't meet 15%, does the replanted tree, and I don't know if we've passed, portion need to be contiguous with the saved portion?
So if a site qualifies for that option of replanted tree save, or if there's a determination that there can be some replanted tree save and there's that 150% punitive component, then yes, the replanted tree save can be provided in other locations that aren't directly contiguous to the primary tree save. Hopefully that made sense. There can be multiple patches. If one of the patches, the replanted tree save, can be somewhere else on the site.
Hi
Questions.
asks, please elaborate more on contiguous criteria. What is minimum area width of green areas?
So we will absolutely elaborate in greater detail in the Charlotte Tree Manual, and I'm not just trying to kick the can and say we'll get back to you on that, but that's a guideline that's going to be pretty dense. Right now we have dimensional requirements in our current tree ordinance guidelines, and we will be carrying that forward in the Charlotte Tree Manual. Contiguous is intended to be one contiguous patch of forest. We kind of talked about some exceptions to that rule a little bit ago. If there's voids in a contiguous patch that are expected to fill in over time through natural forest processes, that will be allowed. That can be included in any contiguous area proposed as tree save. There may be a replanting component of that. We're developing a proximity requirement for individual, or not requirement, guidance for individual trees that are specimen trees or heritage trees, or maybe just regular old plain trees that may be a certain distance from a forested patch. That's the primary contiguous. We want to have some ability for inclusion of those as part of the contiguous. Again, heritage trees, specimen trees that are preserved, that are outside of a contiguous area, they can be counted, and that's an exception where they can be counted in probably all cases. But stay tuned. The Charlotte Tree Manual is going to be a very big guiding document that's going to be based on the intent and purpose. There's not going to be any major curveballs or changes. Any changes to what we're talking about today would have to come through an ordinance amendment process. And we're not looking to do that at this time.
Okay. Next question, Kalia Ligon. Following the completion of the new development, what entities enforce the continued compliance with info presented from the UDO? And I think that might also go along with another question. And I'm just going to skip just a second because it may be hand in hand from Diane. I think it maybe asked, how is this going to be enforced? Will there be urban forestry holds on all single family permits? So I don't know if you can answer those together.
The second part, I know the development center team is talking to the county and trying to develop a reasonable permitting process where holds are part of, a step-by-step process that helps develop a reasonable, workflow for customers and city staff and the county. So that's in the works, and I'm sure that'll be provided, more guidance and clarity will be provided on that in the coming weeks and months. Long-term enforcement will be managed by the urban forestry team. Right now, the urban forestry team serves as plan reviewers, inspectors for all tree requirements. They're also zoning inspectors. Some folks may not be aware of that. Henry's team is commercial zoning inspectors as well. And that team hopefully is expanding in the coming months to take on these additional new regulatory areas. So that hopefully that staff resource level will increase to enforce at time of plan review and permitting, and also long-term compliance. We are proposing a preservation team that will take over in the long-term compliance, which is years after development. There'll be periodic checks to ensure that any required and protected trees are still there, and if not, they'll follow up with property owners to notify them that hey, you're missing some trees, these are required, please plant them back. So they'll be enforced by city staff and on the urban forestry team.
Thanks, Tim. Next question comes from Matthew. Can any land be donated to the city's TCPP, or does it need to meet certain standards?
It would need to meet certain criteria. And again, that's a guideline we're developing. Right now, the TCPP program partners with the Catawba Lands Conservancy. It's a great partnership. Our missions overlap very well. One area where they're not perfectly aligned is acreage requirement. Catawba Lands Conservancy typically wants large tracts of land, 25 acres or greater. That's a lot of trees they have to donate. So we're going to develop criteria in the Charlotte Tree Manual that will clearly say, here's the site conditions that we're open to considering, adopting or taking on for TCPP donation, and size will be part of that. Dimensional components such as width, any restrictions on the property. It won't necessarily have to be 100% forested in every case. There may be opportunities where vacant sites that may have to be replanted will be considered, and we're open to multiple size classes, even down to sub-acre, like below 1 acre in size, because we have another part of that program called the Urban Arboretum Trail that could take on smaller properties like that. But there will be specific criteria. It won't be unbelievably strict, but it will have some level of standards that may kick out some properties that are proposed for donation. Donation is intended to have, I guess, two primary ways to comply. That could be donate the land fee simple, or a donation of a conservation easement. And we're developing those program elements right now. So we will have something in place to review. Again, DSTAC and the Tree Commission, criteria-wise and process-wise for the land donation options. I won't speak for the county, but there's also work taking place now for county park and rec donation, which is very similar. They'll have criteria as well that'll be provided for customers to have, awareness for permitting and due diligence and that type of thing.
Great. The next question comes from, hi, can someone provide scientific reasons behind the minimum 274 square foot threshold?
We can get the specific research and tables and provide them moving forward, but generally put, there's been a lot of research into soil volume and quality that provide adequate growing space for trees to provide high level benefits for economic, social, and environmental reasons. So 274 is a square footage that's based on industry research. And it also very closely connects to the standard size of 2 parking spaces. In terms of the development industry, that's something that we aligned with. It's much smaller than what industry experts, urban forestry industry experts recommend. It's something we require now in many cases, and we're looking to standardize moving forward. But we can provide specific reference to research and scientific results that better explain and answer that question.
Okay.
And follow up in the future.
TJ asks, who determines what is reasonable and what is feasible? As these terms have been, points out, these terms have been used a couple of times.
Great question, right? So the world of trees, especially in risk assessment and health assessment, is very subjective in some ways, but that's not a good thing for development requirements. So the Charlotte Tree Manual, Land Development Standards for Trees, the Administrative Adjustments Table will provide as much clear guidance and objective clarity for feasible and reasonable. Again, there's not an intention for my position or the urban forestry supervisor to have a professional opinion to go out in the field and make these calls on a case-by-case basis. We are going to, we're in the process of developing those guidelines right now for the Charlotte Tree Manual, and we want we want a good check and balance approach with the DSTAC and the Tree Commission to give us feedback on what we propose. Is it reasonable and is it feasible? So that's our strategy and how we approach that.
Thanks. The next question comes from, sorry, chat's moving kind of fast. Kathy Murray, are there plans to address planted trees that die? Will there be enforcement to replant?
Yes, there are plans, and we are hopeful that we obtain the staff resources to do that. So the urban forestry team will be expanding to better achieve City Council's long-term goals for tree canopy objectives. Historically, there's been a policy to conduct what we've called compliance checks, which is checking development sites to see if any required planting or preservation tree or feature is still there. We have not been doing that for many years now as workload and just development has increased. And so we're looking to get back to doing that and hopefully obtaining additional staff resources in the coming months. One of the teams we're proposing is a preservation team as part of the urban forestry group that will be focused on a number of things, and long-term compliance checks is one of those items. This team will also be taking on the non-development heritage tree permitting. That's the other key focus of the preservation team. So yes, we do have plans to address that. It's not going to be perfect, but we're going to increase our focus and activity level around ensuring that there's as many required trees out there growing and alive that should be.
Thank you. Looks like we just have a few more, and I'll ask the team if I missed anything, if you guys could chime in at the end. I tried my best to look where things have been answered. Kristen Mansell asked, what is the CRZ measured? Is it out of the drip line, which would need to be identified on the tree survey, or calculated by a certain ratio of DBH equaling the foot radius?
It'll be based on the current requirement of tree protection of providing 1 foot of space for every inch of diameter. So it will not be based on the drip line. Drip line is a component that may still be used for some provisions, but the CRZ will be based on that 1 foot for every inch diameter protection standard. And there will be flexibility to disturb the CRZ. And for certain, especially for heritage trees, it won't be required to be provided on surveys for all trees and plan and landscape sheets for all trees, but heritage trees will likely get the majority of the focus of that CRZ kind of depiction.
Thank you. I do want to point out this one question, although it's been answered in the chat, because I do think it would be helpful for everyone to hear. Brianna Boyd asks, who can we contact if we have questions later about these tree ordinances? And in the chat, I did place information about the email inbox that is being monitored, that you guys can actually submit questions or comments or thoughts to, and they will, that the CLT development team will disperse and be sure that your questions are answered by the correct staff member. And that email address is cltudoquestions@charlottenc.gov. If you just want to go ahead and write that down or jot that down. It is also on the registration page for which you register for this class. If you want to go back and look, there's some information at the top of the page that includes that email address as well. The next question that we had, I just want to be sure. It's like a lot of things have been answered. Thomas writes, and it looks like a suggestion for long-term enforcement. Can an option be added to the 311 website for citizens to be able to assist urban forestry to identify issues with post-occupancy compliance? And I do think that's something we could obviously discuss with the 311 team to be able to add. So thank you for that comment. And then Carolyn Millen asks, what is the increased number of cities? I think you may have answered some of this, Tim, but what is the increased number of city staffing that has and will be created for this from this new tree canopy section? I think you talked a little bit through what that might look like.
Yeah, the short answer is I don't know, right? City manager and city council will be developing their budget, and like every other department, we've provided recommendations and requests for what we think we need to accomplish our mission. And I will say, not every discipline or ordinance area was completely, reviewed and overhauled and kind of reset. The tree canopy policy and ordinance world was, and there are some major changes here. And so the additional resources are definitely needed, and we're hoping to have, multiple new positions to adequately provide the customer service level that we should, but also to increase our focus and ability to ensure tree canopies there long term. Development is not the only process that protects and preserves and plants trees, but it's one of the major ones. We want to make sure we're giving it the adequate attention at all steps of the way, including post-development, for a focus on trees. So our goal is to equip the urban forestry team in a way that provides resources to do all of that. And I think, I will clarify one thing is that I think the development of a new division for community tree canopy is a great indication of how the manager's office and city council is really emphasizing and focusing a level of importance on tree canopy. And so I do expect some additional resources to help achieve the objectives that we have, both in the UDO and non-regulatory workflows to plant and preserve trees. So it's been a great couple of years of kind of focus and hard work on tree canopy items, and I think we're getting close to the fruition of additional resources to better implement these policies and ordinance concepts.
Okay. It looks like we just have a couple more questions, and let's see. Thomas does point out, as a member of DSTAC, he says we are ready and willing to assist in developing these documents. So thank you for that, Thomas. Joe Padilla, do you expect development plan review time to increase with a tremendous amount of field enforcement these new regs will require. I don't know if that's specific to just trees, but
I don't, not significantly. Not for, I would say, the type of development we currently regulate. No, I think there'll be a learning curve, Joe, for customers and staff to kind of get, to a level where we can be experienced and kind of on top of our game. That's new for everybody. But I will say, in the new regulatory areas, the infill residential single lot stuff, which is on an occurrence level of thousands of permits per year versus hundreds. Those are intended to be very, very quick reviews and inspections. We're talking about sub 30-minute reviews, some cases sub 20-minute reviews. So the occurrence rate's going to be high. There'll be a lot of time put into those, but we're really trying to be expedient to make sure that from a customer perspective, we are not holding things up, that we're making sure we cover all the bases, but so I don't expect a significant increase. I'll say long-term, of course. So no, but in the new regulatory areas, like heritage tree, that's not development. I think that's a really residential infill. And let me go on a little tangent here about non-development heritage trees. That's an entirely new permit process that's not development related. There's a new customer base there. And we have to get the word out to realtors, HOAs, property owners, to make sure people are aware of that regulatory protection for heritage trees and provide a direction on how to come through and get permits to remove those trees. And also, it's going to impact the bottom line for a lot of people. It's going to have financial impacts and also property management decision impacts. So we want to get that word out. But for the stuff we're doing now, I don't expect a very significant increase at all in plan review time.
thanks, Tim. I think we have answered most, if not all. And if we did not answer a question, we do obviously have the ability to come back and see where you have registered and respond to you. Especially if we have said that we would need to follow up for any additional questions. I think that is currently all we have. Again, if you do have questions, please utilize that email address that we have placed in the chat to reach out to the CLT development team in order to have them either pass along your question to the correct staff member or answer it directly for you. So that is definitely open for you to use, and we suggest and ask that you use that. I think that is all we have for today. Thank you, Kate. She's dropped that back in just at the bottom of the chat as well. Thank you very much for your time today. I think we'll end our session there.
One quick thing.
I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. I'm sorry to step on your toes there. I
Okay.
heard a lot about what is CRZ, and there's a definition in the definition section of the UDO. It doesn't provide all the clarity that customers and residents are going to want to need, but need. But there is a definition in the definitions section of the UDO, and just want to make that known. And stay tuned for a tree manual guideline that will better clarify. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.